And I discovered this place. And I'm a very visual person. Maybe that's why it came to me that way. When something catastrophic happens, or I call it a moment of impact, it's like a car comes and hits us. It's very dramatic. And I know I sound like I'm exaggerating, but it is like a really bad accident. That moment of impact derails us and takes us out of the life that we used to have. We can never go back to that old life, ever. Nothing. It's a ghost town. I always say this is a ghost town, and people are trying to reclaim parts of their old life. It will never happen. And I always have chills when I say this, because like I want to save everyone's time. You can never go back. So we get kicked out of that old life, but we don't just walk into the next chapter. It doesn't happen. We go in a place in between first to heal. And people say, give it time, right? Time heals. Wait for time to heal. You don't make any decisions. So the whole world puts us in this waiting room, and we go there.
And wait.
And
wait.
And we wait. And you know what happens then? The brain, the amygdala center, we go in because of our grief, and we stay because of fear. Because the brain, Nicole, gets used to that waiting, and it makes it its default setting. And life reentry for millions of people never ever happen.
Welcome to Empowered Kids TV, where we introduce you to the people and ideas to help you take action and create the family of your dreams. Speaker, author of Second, First, and Where Did You Go? Our guest today is a life strategist. Using her study of neuroplasticity, she created a powerful program that has helped thousands find a path to thriving after loss. For me, what I love about our guest is her ability to help us have open and authentic conversations about how loss of all kinds impacts and shapes our lives, with a determination to show us all that we can find our way back to joy. So please help me to welcome the amazing Christina Rasmussen. Christina, welcome to Proud Kids TV.
Thank you so much for having me, and I am so excited about this conversation.
I know that you started studying grief in your 20s. And
Yes.
that is a strange, like when I think back to my 20s in university, grief seems to, like that age, you feel a little bit invincible, right? Like the whole life ahead of you. Why study grief?
And I don't know if you know this, I studied in the UK.
Yes.
Yes, so I've spent my 20s, I spent 10 years in England. I love the UK. I have a lot of good friends there. I've spent a big portion of my life, and as I was doing my master's in counseling at Durham University, and we had to choose our thesis.
Yes.
I wanted to do it on the stages of bereavement, and I didn't. It was also strange for me, Nicole, I have to tell you. And I remember my professor, and I tell this story, said to me, "You're such a happy person. Why do you want to study such a depressing, topic?" And I said to her, "I love people so much. I couldn't imagine losing them, and I just couldn't imagine it." And I said that I want to know how to help people, you know, heal or grieve after such a catastrophic loss. And of course, at the time, I did not know that not only was I going to lose my husband very, very young, but our first child, and I rarely talk about that, our first child um, was born and died on that same day. I was about 5 months pregnant, and she didn't. She was premature, and she had a lot of things that were wrong, and I remember thinking when his diagnosis took place that this can't be right. how is this happening to me so young? He was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer at age 31, and I was 30. I was 30 years old. And, I was like, you gotta be kidding me. This is so weird. I'm still a happy person, but very sad. And I remember saying to myself, I didn't know it was gonna feel as bad as it did. Yeah.
Tell me about the experience of having that personal journey with grief
Mhm.
and how it compared to what you learned about grief from an academic perspective.
It didn't match.
Yeah.
There was no match. I and thank you for preparing for this interview. So many times people are not prepared, and I can tell you prepared, and I appreciate that a lot. It didn't connect. It was almost like I hadn't studied grief. It was something different, and it was so catastrophic, the grieving process for me, so catastrophic that I didn't think I would make it. And I had two really young children. When he was diagnosed, they were 9 months and 2.5 years old, two girls. And when he died, they were 4 and 6 years old. And I remember thinking, I wish it was me. It would have been the the easier option. and and I didn't think I could make it. And that's when I said, if I ever made it back to living, I would go back and get everyone else.
And do you feel like the option in your mind of it should have been me,
Mm-hmm.
was that also wrapped into the fact that this wasn't just a journey of grief, but he was the breadwinner
Oh,
and
yes.
you were at home? And so you had to figure out a whole new life. Was that wrapped into it?
Talk about he was the smart one. This is my. We'll talk about the survivor self later on. This was he was the smart one. He is considered a genius. His IQ was off the charts. He went to a special school when he was a kid. He was really smart, and I didn't have a job here in the US. My green card was still pending before he died. We actually, the green card came through literally 6 months before he died. And I remember him saying, now I can die. He said that, and it was so dramatic. I said, why do you have to be so dramatic? I remember telling him that. I mean, no, you can't die now. Just because I can get a job, it doesn't mean you die. This is what he said, his words. Now I can die. I said, what are you talking about? And I had to find a way to be a single parent and get a job and going back to school, because at the time I said there's no way I could help anyone in their grief when I'm in deep grief. No way. It's impossible. So yeah, it was definitely, how am I going to do that? How am I going to do this in a foreign country? I never worked in the US before. None, zero. I was a stay-at-home mom because of that and because she was sick. And he worked all the way. He went to work all the way to like 10 days before he died.
You know what? And I think that speaks volume to the journey he had. Even the
Yeah,
conversation of him saying, now I can die. Because I know you shared that he didn't just work till the end, but he fought. Like he
yeah.
fought for it.
He fought Nicole so hard. And the journey of he was when he was diagnosed, they said it could be 6 months. It was terminal from the beginning. It was stage 4. It had spread to the rest of his body. And colon cancer at age 31 is very rare, my friend. It is like, it doesn't happen. Most of the times you have to be 45, 50, 60, 70. Colon
Mhm.
cancer is not for the young. And we fought it, and he lived with it for 3.5 years after the initial terminal diagnosis, which at the time was a big deal, that we were alive for 3.5 years. Yeah, we were fighting it.
Tell me a little bit about the early stages. So, did you feel like you had the effects of trauma and anxiety as you were trying to find your way, and how did you cope with that?
Yeah, and it's so interesting because trauma and anxiety changed so much over the journey. even now, 14 years later, and we'll talk about that as we go forward in the conversation. But I was, at first, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't eat anything, and I couldn't cry.
Mm.
And that to me was very confusing because I was so devastated. He was the love of my life at the time. I would say I'm in love with a dead guy. Like I'm in love with him and I can't be with him. Like he was, I, I used to say he was my everything. I was in love. I was in love with my husband so much. And when he died, it was just, I couldn't, like the tear, I was in such shock. I think my body was in so much shock that I was losing, I think, a pound every couple of days. I went down to 116 pounds. And for me, that was, I looked like a child. I was boned and like I was just looked like not the 34-year-old woman that I was at the time. I lost a lot of weight and I didn't eat and I couldn't sleep. And it was just a trauma of like it was physically so hard to be alive. I guess that's the best way to describe it. There was a physical, and I was nauseous, and like people, when I was studying grief and when I've heard about other people's journeys, nobody said anything about the physicality of it. My body couldn't cope with the grief. It was hard.
You know what, you talk about loss as something that can be evolutionary if we
Mm-hmm.
use it to re-enter. And the term re-enter kind of stuck for me. And I wanted to ask if it feels like it's almost like you lost your place in life, like life is moving on a conveyor belt and somehow you got pushed off and you need to find your way back onto that moving belt where you can join everybody
Mm-hmm.
else. Is that what it felt like?
Yeah, in many ways it did. And I also felt like I died. I didn't know who I was. I didn't have the same needs. I did not see the world the way that everyone else saw the world. Felt like I had nothing in common with my friends,
Mm.
nothing in common with anyone. I had witnessed death in such a close proximity, and everything was different. And I had no idea, Nicole, what it would take to get me back on track. Like I thought it would be impossible. I really believe that. But it is, and because of that, to talk about the evolution portion of it, because in many ways you die, everything you knew died. Everything you, I was so innocent before. I thought life was just, not that I didn't know there were bad things that happened to people. Obviously, I did, but they were supposed to happen like
Like,
later,
yeah.
so much later. Now this, what is this? Now it was almost like someone came in and robbed all of my dreams. The people, the person that I loved, the father of my children. They adored him like the father of my children, and that I could never make better.
Yeah.
Their dad is gone forever. I could not change that. I couldn't. I really believe in doing everything you could to change your life. That was at the time unchangeable. Nothing could change. I couldn't bring their dad back.
You're talking right to my heart. So this is one that and it's probably a difficult question for me to articulate, but I'd like to explore if grief is different based on the expectation you had first before the grief. So at the end of 2019, my cousin took her only daughter for her last childhood vaccination, and 17 days later, she died.
Oh my God.
And that was different for me than losing my four grandparents. Like there was an expectation
Mm-hmm.
that they would die. They had lived their lives fully. A couple of them were at the point where they were ready to make their transition openly in conversation. So that felt, there was sadness,
Mm-hmm.
but nothing, absolutely nothing like the grief of a 12-year-old unexpectedly dying. And wrapped in that, I think for a lot of family members who were surrounding my cousin as she tried to deal with what was happening in her life, was that helpless feeling of, I cannot fix this. There is nothing I can do to make this better for her, no matter. And I even bargained with God. So it's like I did try. But that feeling, so this is two parts to a question.
Mhm.
One, in your experience, is grief different based on the expectation you had before?
Mhm.
And that notion of, I want to fix it, whether it's for yourself or for others, is that based on the expectation, or is it just part of the grief process?
Grief is different based on the relationship first, and based on the expectation second. And not that the relationship, and I will explain what that means, but the expectation that this child was supposed to be older, and my expectation that I was supposed to live with him for many years together, that this is not something that we deal with it. But also because I've lived this life, I've done this work for the last 10 years. I have seen, oh my gosh, I feel so blessed to have journeyed with so many thousands of people's different losses, and I've seen a 70-year-old husband who's losing the love of his life at 70. Let's say they had been together for 50 years, and that for him is the most devastating thing that he could ever imagine. The partner in life, and maybe they lost their child 5 years prior, but they had each other. So it very, like, it's such a, or you have someone who um, loses a sister, but they was the best friend, or a mother who was the best friend, like a parent who they did everything together. And then she was 70 years old, let's say she was 80, and every time this daughter had a difficult day, she would pick up the phone and call her mother. That relationship is the number one reason as to why this grief is so hard. And then of course, losing a child at any age is the most catastrophic thing. um, but the relationship dictates, I think, there's something about love equals grief, or something about there's something about that. I have seen mothers grieve differently. I've seen from other mothers. Um, I've seen spouses also do that very differently. It just varies a lot, but the expectation is also very significant. And I agree with you. The sudden nature of it, it wasn't supposed to happen, and it's too soon. It's like someone giving you, I know it's a horrible example, but someone giving you a cone of ice cream and you're about to eat it and they take it away and you haven't even had a chance.
Yeah,
It's better, it's that's hard. And I know it doesn't, that example is a
I
silly
get it.
example, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. I asked my cousin if there was one thing. It's been just over a year on her journey now,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm amazed by her almost every day, to be honest. But I asked her if there was one thing she could ask you, what she would ask, and she wanted to ask about faith,
Mm-hmm.
um, and how your faith changed before and after. So for her, she had what she would consider strong faith, a great
Mm-hmm.
relationship with God based on her beliefs, and felt like she lived a life of gratitude, where now she feels very angry with God. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a good question. Anger is such an important part of this process, and I think God um, is is smiling because that's the way it's supposed to. I think that's, we're supposed to feel that. We have to feel that. And then also faith will change and evolve in the same way our life will evolve and our identity will evolve with something so catastrophic. She went through something, I just I that's the thing. I don't think people can understand the I don't think people can ever understand the pain that someone like her is going through. Like the pain that she's experiencing, even if she looks great and is doing well now, is impossible to capture in words, and nobody could ever understand this unless they have gone through something very similar. It's almost like, I always say grief takes place outside of our bodies and outside of time and space. It's impossible for the body to capture the grief in the beginning, and 1 year is such a short amount of
Mm.
time. It's a difficult thing. So faith will change, and it will be what it will be for her, and to trust that journey, however unique it is, and to trust how she feels with it. It's meant to be this way. I do believe if we were not supposed to go through this harsh and horrible experience, we wouldn't it wouldn't be a part of our lives. There would
You know what?
never be. It wouldn't be here.
So this wasn't one of my questions, but it is something I've been pondering, especially since we've been going through our own grief process. I really have this fundamental belief that nothing in life is by accident.
Mm-hmm.
All of it is designed in a way for us to get something out of it, even though we might not know what it is. So, like in the past, I've thought about why does the birthing process have to be painful for a mother, right?
Right? What's up with
Um,
that?
and I don't know, like, yeah, we could have a rewrite on that one, but
Yes.
I think about grief and try to understand what is it, where is its place in us evolving as humans, as individual beings, and even as communities and little
Mhm.
villages. And I was wondering if you had some thoughts on that after being in that space for such time.
I used to say that grief is an evolutionary experience, and it is it's humans' evolutionary advantage. This is how we end up evolving and growing. And I have always said that if it wasn't for that catastrophic event, and one of the things I've written, and people have shared this, the most of everything I've written is that if you've been through the, unthinkable, you can do the impossible or the unimaginable. So if we didn't have this catastrophic event, we wouldn't even I would never have been able to discover what I'm capable of either.
Mm.
I would never have written books. I wouldn't it would never We wouldn't be having this conversation. This would never have happened. And there's probably a lot of things like that that have taken place because of devastating loss. But I always struggled with the statement, everything happens for a reason.
Mm.
Maybe this could have happened a little later. Maybe, I've had conversations with my kids. Would you choose the grief you experienced at 4 and 6, which was easier because you were not conscious enough, and you were not aware of what a devastating event it was? Yes, you cried, but you also went and played afterwards. It was children
Mm.
are, they're not resilient. I don't like that word. Children are in a place in their lives when they're so young that their brain is processing things very differently.
Differently.
So it looks like they're resilient, but they're
Mm.
not. They're just processing grief and life and play all at the same time, and they're equally important, right? So I think that's what's happening. And they both said they would have taken the grief, the harder grief
To have it
now
happen. Yeah.
than earlier on
Yeah.
when they can't remember their grief.
Yeah. I think sometimes that statement, it all happens for a reason, is a way of comforting ourselves when we're looking for a reason and we can't find one.
So well said, Nicole. Exactly. It's because this had to happen, and there was no way around it, right? And yeah, I agree with you completely.
Let's talk a little bit about the re entry process,
Mhm.
how you came up with it. And I really want to dive deeply into the whole concept of the waiting room.
Well, I remember getting myself back. in life with this burden that your cousin is experiencing. You know, you go back to work. For me, I was the year before he died, I went back to school while raising two little girls, having a terminally ill husband, and going to college.
I absolutely don't know how you did that.
I don't know how I did that. Like, I look back and I'm like, whoever was there, you know, maybe she can pay me a visit now whenever I have a hard day. Like, that was hard. And so I did another postgraduate degree in human resource management because in my head, the survivor self, which we'll talk about that, said, Christina, you need to go and have a job at the corporate world because they will give you insurance and they will give you money. And then I calculated how much money I can make all the way until they're 18, so I could pay for their college. In the US, it's very expensive to go to college.
I just feel all that pressure all on you all at once.
Oh, and I had no family close by. So and I didn't want my kids to be raised by my mom. So I said to her also, you need to go back to Greece, come back and see me, but I got
Go
to do it.
home.
And another crazy idea of mine at the time, I wanted to prove it to who was I proving this to? I don't know. I was very strong apparently. So parents went home to Greece. I was the one in charge raising my children, and I have done an amazing job, and we will talk about that too. But I could have used a little more help. And so they went to preschool, and one preschool, one kindergarten at the time. I finished after he passed. I went back to finish that graduate degree. I got an entry level job at a big pharmaceutical company, entry level, very little money, and I went inside that grind and started that road, and it was horrible. Life reentry that way, which was the worst way possible, looked very painful for me. And as time went by, I started to think about, okay, and I looked great. Oh, this is the funny part. I looked the best about 2 years in to the grieving journey. I looked like of the best way I've ever looked in my life.
Well pulled together.
Very much. It was like just like amazing. I looked really good by that. I started eating again. I put on, so I was at the perfect weight ultimately. The hair was very shiny, like, and I'm joking when I say this because I was like, how is that possible that I look so good and I'm dying inside?
Inside.
Dying inside. So the duality of loss, right? Everything breaks on the inside, you know, everything looks the same on the outside, and that is the hard thing. So I started on this journey, and I did not feel like I was happy. Even 3 4 years in, I was like, why am I not happy? Why am I not experiencing life? Why can I not feel fulfilled? And I remember, I mean, I met Eric. We married 4 years after Biana died. He had also lost his wife. That's how we met. And we blended, that's another conversation about children, blended two families of deep grief together. It's just,
It's a power role right there.
yeah, it's just interesting journey. And I realized that there was something wrong, that there was something not right. I wasn't moving forward. I was looping. I was recycling. I was going around in circles. I wasn't feeling better. And I discovered, and I started at the time seeing clients again. I started seeing very similar patterns. And I discovered this place. And I'm a very visual person. Maybe that's why it came to me that way. When something catastrophic happens, I call it a moment of impact. It's like a car comes and hits us. It's very dramatic, and I know I sound like I'm exaggerating, but it is like a really bad accident. That moment of impact derails us and takes us out of the life that we used to have. We can never go back to that old life, ever. Nothing. It's a ghost town. I always say this is a ghost town, and people are trying to reclaim parts of their own life. It will never happen. And I always have chills when I say this because, like, I want to save everyone's time. You can never go back. So we get kicked out of that old life, but we don't just walk into the next chapter. It doesn't happen. We go in a place in between first to heal, and people say, give it time, right? Time heals.
Good.
Wait for time to heal. You don't make any decisions. So the whole world puts us in this waiting room, and we go there,
And wait,
and
and wait, and
and
wait.
we wait. And you know what happens then? The brain, the amygdala center, we go in because of our grief, and we stay because of fear. Because the brain, Nicole, gets used to that waiting, and it makes it its default setting. And life reentry for millions of people never ever happen. It never happens. They die in there. They spend all of their life thinking that's their new life and it's meant to be this way, and they never leave. And the life reentry model takes people from the waiting room. And most of the times, people say, when is a good time to do the life reentry work? I say always, depending on the loss, whether it's a death, divorce, job loss, or whatever it is, depending on that, 2 or 3 years after is the best time because the model works when we have that stuck feeling that we are not moving forward. Life reentry is not about grieving; it's about living. And I always say, yes, there's time to grieve, but there's also time to live after loss, and we don't take care of that part because we think we know when we're told that grief is meant to last forever. Memories and missing the person lasts forever. But life is supposed to come back to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't still be here. There's a reason why we are. So life reentry deactivates the fear center with very small, specific tasks and starts the journey of reentry into a new life, finally. And I have been blessed to have taught the life reentry model to many thousands of people now, and it's been an honor of my life. And we are in clinical trials as well right now.
I want to talk a little bit more about the fear that keeps you stuck in that waiting room. Specifically because I think we're talking about great loss, like loss of loved ones, but there's loss of all forms. And what I love about your work is that you show us that the whole process of getting stuck in that waiting space is the same when we lose a loved one versus when we lose a marriage, when we lose even sometimes our businesses. So anything that feels like it was part of our identity and now that's gone, you had that crash moment, we can get stuck in there. And I remember my cousin saying to me, and I can see that there are times when she feels a little better, and she gets really close to joy. And
And
then
then it gets pulled back. That's the waiting room. That's the survivor self. That's the fear, right? And it's okay to get pulled back. I always say I'm a bit of a nerd with this model. I know exactly what she needs to do. So it's okay to be pulled back as long as you know that you're back in the waiting room. Take your day there. Take a couple of days. Take the time you need. I have waiting room days. It's actually, I love it. I'm like, this is gonna be my waiting room day. Give me the popcorn. I don't need to change the world. I don't need to even do one thing today. I don't even need to change for my pajamas. Just don't bother me. And there's no shame in that. There's no shame in going in there just to cry all day long. So as long as you know where you are, and this is not your everyday life, then you choose your reentry moment. And sometimes just reentering for 10 minutes and then back, also depending on, because she's so early on in the journey. What's your first name?
her name
Your
is
cousin?
Carrie.
Carrie. So Carrie,
Yes.
it's okay to go back into the waiting room and take yourself there and take care of yourself there. And then every time you want to go out, make sure that you do it without activating the fear center. So we sneak out of the waiting room in the beginning, because the fear center, the survivor self. So there's three personas in life reentry that I've created. The survivor self, that's protected us in the beginning of our loss. It kept us safe. Go in the waiting room. I'm going to take care of you. You need to protect yourself. This is very painful. Then we have the watcher self, which is the wise part of us that has always been there for us. But that part of us, Nicole, gets squashed from the survivor self. So, people always say there's this fog after loss. You can't make decisions. You can't make choices. All of a sudden, all of your wisdom kind of goes out the window. That's the survival self squashing anything that the watcher self, the witness, has to say. And then the thriver self is that kid inside of us that we have to find our way to remind ourselves of that part of us. That is the part of us that can get us out of there, even for 5 minutes. And the watcher is the wisdom that we need to say yes to the thriver self. And we get out.
Beautiful.
And then we come back when we need to, and that's okay. And there's no guilt or shame. And I think validating this process and validating the waiting room experience and validating the fear, because the waiting room becomes a home for so many people for many years to come, because life gets harder and harder as the longer we take to re-enter. It really gets hard.
I see that in all aspects. I see that for a lot of women that I interact with who are solo parenting, and feel like it's so much easier. Like, I even have women in my family life who have stayed single, so their marriages probably fell apart in the end of their 30s, early 40s, and stayed single all the way up into their 60s, because it was the fear of what that could look like if I step out of this space. And so I love that the fact that you're saying there's a validation to the fact this is where I am. So there's no hiding it from yourself or from anyone else. There's just this recognition that this is where I am, because I think that then brings the compassion to allow you to make the incremental steps.
Oh my God, you said the word compassion. In my last life reentry class, I introduced the compassion scale, because when we start this journey, we actually don't have a lot of compassion for ourselves. And by the end of the class, especially one of the things that I've realized halfway through this last decade of our life reentry is that the reason why we get pulled back long term, not in the beginning, but long term, when we never really, really, really re-enter, is the invisible losses that we've had in our lives. Some of them stem from, and I hope my book proposal on that book on re-entry from invisible losses with my publisher right now. So we're waiting to hear. Is it a yes? Hopefully it will
It's
be.
gonna be a yes.
I
I'm
hope
giving
so.
this nod.
I hope so, because people say, people who come to the work because they've lost someone, they tell their friends who haven't lost anyone, and it helps them. And they say, oh, can I bring my whole family, even though they're not, grieving the same thing. There's the invisible losses are actually harder to re-enter from, because you don't even know what you're dealing with there. So you end up, I've met people where they can't get out of the waiting room even 10, 15 years later. And it's not because they're still actively grieving. It's because of something completely different that the brain has done to them. The survivor self has protected them in so many different experiences. And invisible losses can be some things that are very small, Nicole. For example, a hard conversation that you had with a friend once when you were 15, and you'll remember it to this day, and it changed your behavior because of it. That's just one of the many examples. And that was very traumatic for you then, but nobody really spoke to you about it, because, hey,
Yep.
What? Nothing happened to you, right?
Yep.
It's not
Yeah.
even a small trauma. It's not even a small T. It's not even considered a trauma. We don't even, but that was a big moment that you were grieving something really painful in that moment in time. And there was no validation, no acknowledgement, but the survivor self protected you. So we actually create that survivor self because we are all alone in these invisible experiences, Nicole.
Mm.
And I can scream it from the roof, like I am like just just beyond about this. And I hope this next book, hopefully, if when it gets sold to a publisher, then it will take at least 2 years for it to come out. But but the work, I hope, on invisible losses. So I talk about these things on my classes and all the interviews I do. So anyone who's listening to this, I want them to trace back something that has happened that derailed them, that
Mm.
you left the old identity
Mm.
because of that considered small event, and you never really found your way out of the waiting room because of that moment in time.
I have so many that I can think of.
And
Those
that is true.
yeah.
There's so many. And once we put the attention into that as a real thing, the brain will scan. We can sit now, we can sit down and literally make a whole map of all these invisible experiences that
Mhm.
influenced your life, Nicole.
You know what I love about this conversation? I started off thinking, grief is something that's part of all of our lives, but for some reason we're afraid to talk about it.
Yes,
And I even in that space, I'm thinking the big griefs, right? You lose a
yeah,
loved one, which we will all experience. 50
yes.
something percent of marriages are failing, and that's just the people that actually walk down the aisle and sign a piece of paper. So you think of the big things, but I'm not even thinking of the little things like we're talking about now. Yeah. That really impact all of our lives, and the fact that we're still afraid to have the conversation about how to manage the grief in a healthy way.
Most people grieve at least once a day,
Oh,
every day. Some people many times. If we were to sit down and say, okay, tell me about your day, because you're in England, so your day's nearly done. We can find a moment that was hard. You felt it and you moved through it and out of it because you have things to do, and life to live, and but it wasn't processed and it wasn't validated and it wasn't considered significant,
yeah.
but it's there. So imagine if we could change, not only change the conversation around grief, but make it what it is, a daily experience. Sometimes it's grief that we can feel and it's okay, and sometimes it's the catastrophic events, like a loss of a child or a husband, or an unexpected accident or whatever it is, but we feel it every day. And this is why I believe suicides happen. It is the invisible losses that can take someone's life. People always say, but there was their
Fine.
life was great.
Yeah, they're
Really?
fine. Yeah.
They didn't go through any sexual abuse, they didn't have physical abuse, they had great parents, they had all of those things, and yet we don't know what they were dealing with because they were too ashamed to say anything, because the world around them taught them, and us and you and everyone, that these are things that you should
Okay.
just
Yeah.
move on. There's nothing, come on.
Just life.
It's just a conversation, you know.
Yeah.
And I've had parents write to me, they found their kids, you know, taking their lives because they had been ashamed. They've had a moment of shame in school by a friend.
Mm.
And there's just one example, famous people who take their lives.
That's true.
Success is an invisible loss.
Mm.
That's another conversation, my dear friends.
Mm.
Success has a lot of loss in it. People
Oh,
don't even know, like, it is so much loss.
I'm gonna need another hour just on that one.
Just on that, yeah.
Let's talk through the re-entry process. You've got some phases there. So let's
Yes.
quickly kind of guide people what the phases are.
So the first step, the first stage, the first phase is that I call it the seeing. We have to see everything that has been unseen all this time. We have to make visible what's invisible. And that week in the group, my goal is that every church, every hospital will have life reentry support groups one day. Imagine that.
That would be awesome.
That'd be great. And hopefully they'll be free. That's why we're building a life reentry foundation. That's the goal. That's the plan. That's the dream. That's the vision one day. So the first step is that you have to see what was not shown to you all these years of your life, whether it's the invisible loss that stems from a tragic loss, like things that you lost because of that loss. People say, do you mean secondary losses? I'm like, no, invisible, unvalidated, unacknowledged, and invisible to you as well. Not secondary, not the loss of finance or the loss of job security. It's a lot of things that are in the details, that they're also live inside stories that you tell someone, and then you find the invisible losses, and then invisible losses that have taken place throughout your life, but nobody said this was a loss. So we find them. That's the first step. The second step is the first time we start to take over the code of the survivor self, the narrative of the survivor self, by doing this exercise. And we do it 7 days straight. And it's hard. These first 2 weeks are hard, Nicole, are hard. So the second week is all about doing a grief cleanse. So we imagine if you grab the pen and you start to write whatever is coming through. No, filtering.
Yeah.
And just write and write and write and write and write a page. Then I ask people to look at that page and read it and see what is being repeated and looping. What is the pattern? What is the survivor self? Because the survivor self is trying to protect you. And so you find the pattern in that page, and then you reframe it. You change the pattern. You interrupt it. And people have a lot of resistance in that final part, because how do you change? Because the survivor self is speaking. Because the survivor self doesn't want you to interrupt his language, right? So I say, how do I change something so bad in my life? And I help them to do that part. So that's the cleansing week. So the seeing week, the cleansing and reframing, we take back the controls a little bit, we learn. And then the third week is, I call it the plug-in. That is when we start for the first time to take our first steps out of the waiting room in the smallest possible ways. We literally sneak out of the fear center. We get out and in, and we have to do it in a way that doesn't activate that fear, because the moment that happens, it's almost like sneaking out and the monster is asleep. I mean, this is exactly like that. And so I say to people, I want you to do things that are really easy, that you like to do, but they're very easy, no difficulty. And then slowly we increase that difficulty, but it's easier and easier. And then the next week is about discovery and shifting. And we introduce the survivor self in the plug-in week. We introduce the watcher self in the shift week, where we are looking at our lives from a different vantage point. So we're creating that perspective, and we're plugging in from that place of the watcher self, like the witness, the wiser part. And all of a sudden the narrative is really starting to change that. Actually, you can see during that halfway point in the class, if you were to look at the language of the beginning to the middle part, it's almost like they're different people. It's starting. So the reentry actually is an inner experience more than anything else. You're starting to look at yourself from a different place. We never give advice. I never tell people what to do. The watcher self, will find the solution, and we do these exercises to remind us of who we really are, to really reclaim part of the identity we lost and find the new one that's waiting for us. And then after discovery, who are we becoming? That's when the thriver comes in and says, "Do you remember when we used to play and we used to jump in the lake with no clothes on? What would that look like now?" And by then you start to see a more rebellious side of us coming out. And then the final step is reentry, where we write what I call the Thriver Manifesto. And let me tell you, that final homework, remember, you start from that beginning to the end, because it's almost like the rules, or it's the manifest, the statement of your life, to remind you whenever you forget, whenever you go back into that waiting room, to remind you why it's great to be out of there and what are the rules of your new life. It's like almost like the grounding of reentry. It keeps us out longer. So that Thriver Manifesto ends, and then we're actually, for the first time in 10 years, I'm adding, the next class will have 2 extra weeks. So it will be 8 weeks, because I need to help them more with integration. I use life reentry in my everyday life. Sometimes you do the life reentry practice as a whole, and other times you just take parts of it and use them accordingly to how your life is, your days. So we will spend, for the first time, the last 2 weeks integrating the practice into their lives.
It's beautiful.
So that's more or less what happens.
Absolutely beautiful. Before we wrap up, because I can talk to you forever,
Me
um,
too.
I wanted to touch on kids.
Yes, of course.
Of course. Uh, Two things came up for me. One, the harrowing thought of a mother having to prepare two little girls for the fact that their dad was going to die. And my own experience, when my cousin's daughter died, our kids are all stacked. So my youngest son is about 6 months younger than Katie, my niece. And when she died, he said to me, and he's a very innocent little one, and he said to me, "You know what? I knew mummies and daddies died, but I never knew kids died."
Yeah.
And I could see in that moment that the world that he had was just crumbling.
Yes.
And so the question is, how do you prepare your kids for grief, knowing that that process is going to change their view of the world forever?
Always be honest with them. And I will never stop saying that. I have met parents who hid the truth from their kids, even some, they hid deaths. They didn't tell them, they didn't know. Always tell them the truth, even when you're not ready to tell them. And prepare them. Prepare them. Prepare them for anything that's going to happen. And I think the version of the world that he had before this loss died. It's like he has to go through the reentry process in many ways, because that version made himself safe, that he could never die,
Yeah,
that he could never lose his life because only older people died. So now, will I die? Will my friends die?
absolutely.
And that changed everything for him. So now the new filter is putting everything through that new truth. And he's like, the question that the survivor self, so the survivor self is protecting him. It's like, who else could die? Let's protect ourselves from that pain. And if we don't validate and acknowledge the feelings, and a grief cleanse can also be a verbal thing. So for kids, actually, the life reentry on kids is even easier than adults, because it's play, right? It's, who is that, your survivor self? Is that your kid self, your thriver self? What are you gonna do? Like, who's speaking to you? Who's speaking to me right now, right? His protector part is protecting him from any additional loss of someone he knows who's a kid, or himself. So he's probably being more, he's pulling back a little bit, and you'll see it directly and indirectly sometimes, or he will act out, in that moment in time, finding out exactly what's going on, whether it's through words, through play, through through whatever it is, whatever chance someone has to talk about whatever it is that's happening. And questions like, what are you feeling, may not be right for kids, but more like, um, you know, be part of a conversation. So they could be talking about something at school. If you're having that in mind, that he's afraid and he's referring to someone else being sick or someone else having something, just be very direct. Did that remind you of your cousin? Don't hide away from it. That's what I would say to parents. Like, is that a reminder? Did you remember? Let's, what do you think? Also, when you're in transition, when you're in the car driving, it's better times when you're doing an activity, so the
Yeah.
attention is not all on him. That's when this so it's just very different than adults when we really have to sit down and talk about something. Kids have this conversation when you're moving.
Yes.
They happen easier sometimes. Yeah.
That's when I get the juice out of them. In the
First,
car ride is
yes,
the car.
yes,
And you're absolutely right, Christina. So he morphed into a different child, like
right.
a completely different child, because it all got stacked up. So this was Kitty died in October of 2019. Right after that, like literally 2 weeks after, he started having his own health challenges, and then
Yes,
we moved into a pandemic.
yep.
And he before this he was the adventurer. Like I couldn't hold him because the more I
That's the
tried to
thriver
hold
self.
him,
That's the thriver self. Do you see? This is, you can
yes,
see it.
you
Like
can
you
see,
see, you can see it.
yeah. And no, and like throughout last year he became very anxious, afraid of the dark, afraid to be alone. Like it took me right back to like having a toddler, having
Yes.
to relearn how to parent him because he was a very different child.
And he's in the waiting room, right? So he's not lost. He's just, the survival self is speaking to him, he's protecting, he's afraid, it's the fear, remember that. And slowly he needs to start to trust the world again
Hmm.
and re-enter in small ways, plugins, 5%. That's what I call them, the 5% little tiny things. And with validation, this must be so hard for you. That's the validating of things, and that he's not overreacting. And that's so hard on a parent because you just want him to be better. I want them all. What's this? Let's move on. My
What?
kids, it's so funny. My kids, they have to grieve in the future, right? So they
Hmm.
grieve differently. As they were aging, grief would look different.
Yeah.
All the way to some of the best grief conversations we've ever had, where during the pandemic, as a 20-year-old and an 18-year-old, and this summer, my older daughter Lena said to me, I didn't know then what a big loss losing a father was until later.
Hmm.
How old is your son?
He's 12.
Yes, and he's going through other changes now on
Yeah.
top of
Yes.
the
Yeah.
this big moment, this moment of impact for him. So
Yeah.
this loss is different for you, it's different for your cousin, and it's different for him. It's completely different experience.
Yeah. I can see that. And it's almost tangible. It's so different
That's right.
in the
Yeah.
experiences. Okay, my last question. Before I ask you my last question, tell everybody where we can find out more about you, where we can get your books, where we can do the workshop.
I have so many websites. I need to like just have one in the future. But so we have the Dear Life podcast that is every week. I felt that was the thing that was missing. So I interview amazing people, and I also have my solo episodes, dearlifepodcast.com. I have ChristinaRasmussen.com that has really everything. LifeReenter.com that has the classes. Secondfirst.com, I'm so sorry. Secondfirst.com is where the weekly letter, I write a weekly letter I've written it for 10 years. Every Friday, people subscribe to that letter. It comes to your inbox and it's different every Friday. And basically just Google my name and things will pop up. And the books, Where'd You Go and Second Firsts, are my two books that they've also been translated. And I think that there's the British versions are available as
Yes.
well. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay, my last question. What does it mean to you to live an empowered life?
I want to be empowered to make the right choices for myself. And I think that has been the hardest thing for me. That you become a caregiver, you become protector of your children, as a spending 4 years being a single parent. And even when I remarried, I was still a single parent. I mean, he's not their dad. He was more of a friend. You know, he's and I'm using past tense because they're in college now. They're not in our homes anymore. I think being empowered for me is choosing, and I'm actually writing about choices on. I wrote it just before we met. I finished the blog that will go out tomorrow. It's about being empowered to make the right choice for yourself at this moment, because the choice you made a year ago, 2 years ago, is not the right choice for you anymore. And we need to ask over and over, because we have to go through different reentries. What is the right choice for me today? And my life, the choices I've made when he died 10 years ago when I started this work, if I was to start over today, it would look like a very different life. And that is we owe it to ourselves. And the only way we can, for me, empowerment, power, living a true life, being in a real life reentry mode is to choose for yourself every day. And that's a hard thing to do.
So beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing today. This was an amazing conversation.
And Nicole, I just want to say you're an amazing interviewer, and I have loved every second of my time with you. And it's been a while since I've had such a great conversation on an interview. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Empowered Kids TV. I'd like you to do us 2 favors. If this is your first time here, be sure to subscribe and press the bell icon so we can notify you of upcoming episodes and you don't miss any of our amazing programs. And if you found value, please share it. It still takes a village. So share this with your family and friends. As we always say here at Empowered Kids TV, you're just one connection away. With love and gratitude, empower us. Until next time.